You wanted to know about B-17 pilot training. Well, largely it's a matter of putting across what we know about the airplane, what it'll do and what it shouldn't be asked to do. Maybe airplanes are like people. You don't really get to know them until after you've lived with them a while. Takes time, too, to get well acquainted with an airplane. Time to find out just how far you can go with her and still stay friends. That's important. And men like our instructor have lived with this airplane long enough to become pretty good friends with her. So his job is just a matter of giving you the benefit of his experience. The procedure is pretty well standardized, and you'll learn to be thankful for that. Routine, like this circle tour of the airplane at the start, for instance, makes the student's life a lot simpler. In the cockpit, you'll learn to follow the checklist because it helps you to keep your mind on your work. Detail's important when you're flying a big bomber, and using the checklist means you don't overlook a thing. After you get the plane off the ramp and down near the runway, you're ready for the run-up, one of the most important checks of all.
Set her at an angle. That gets all your props safe over concrete for the run-up, and if there's a guy behind you, you won't blast him when you rev him up.
As your co-pilot, the instructor locks the tail wheel while she's rolling, so that when the wheel's in line, the lock pin will drop into place. Tail wheel locked. And brakes.
Brakes set.
Maybe here you'll switch to interphone. Easier to talk that way. Then the checklist again, and the instructor's command to check trim tabs. Set them at 0. Elevator trim tab, rudder, aileron. Then,
before the run-up, always check your oil temperature. You ought to have at least 40 degrees before beginning the run-up.
Why not close cowl flaps? Hurry it up a little.
It might mean trouble. If you close them, you get uneven cooling, local hot spots, metal fatigue.
I get it. Just like bending a wire back and forth until it breaks.
That's it.
Exercise turbos?
Right.
You advance throttles to 1,500 RPM for turbo exercise. And you know why it's important. To get warm oil circulating through the turbo regulators. If regulator oil is stiff or congealed, the turbo wastegates won't react properly. One avoidable cause of a runaway turbo on takeoff. Leaving turbos on, you do a repeat on the props. Give them plenty of time to change pitch. Watch the tacks for that. If it's below freezing, exercise both turbos and props 4 times. Set the lock to keep the levers from creeping. And then, turbos off. And before the mag check, another important detail.
Before you rev them up, turn on your generators and check each one for ampere output. If they balance, they're all putting out all right.
Ampere output okay.
Now voltage and then turn them off.
$28.5 on each. Generators checked and off.
Check mags at 28 inches, starting with number 1.
While you're boosting manifold pressure, you remember there's a backfire hazard during the mag check. So you check turbos off, wastegates open, just to be sure.
Off. Left.
Don't watch the tank, watch the engine. Roughness doesn't always give you a quick drop in RPM.
Both. Right. Both.
Throttle up to the stop. A quick check of manifold pressure, and then full turbo. Since you're using 91 grade fuel here, you can't draw 46 inches. Power's cut about 10%. You set your lock, check RPM, little below 2,500 on this fuel. Take a look at the engine, and everything okay. Act slowly on the throttle because of the induction backfire hazard. Same procedure on all engines. Act to command to call the tower for takeoff clearance, and you're off to the races.
Lock tail wheel.
Parking brakes. Hold it with your feet on the runway. Less hazard if you have to get away fast. Gyro. Set the gyro compass and check your compass heading against the heading of the runway.
Gyro set.
Generators.
Generators on.
Tailwheel locked. Light out. Now let's see your rider. 3-point takeoff.
3-point?
3-point. Hold the tail down, but don't give it enough pressure to cause a lot of wheel drag. And remember, you fly the airplane. I'll watch the engine.
The cow flaps open?
Right. Hold the brakes until you get 25 inches, then let her go. You'll have rudder control by the time you're hitting 50 miles an hour. With a crosswind, you might have to use the throttles a little. Rudder's enough today.
On 100 octane, you'd be using 46 inches and 2,500 RPM. Little less than that with this fuel. You'll leave the ground at around 100 miles an hour. Then a kick on the brakes to stop the wheel spin and gear up. Get rid of that drag fast. In takeoff emergencies, the bare belly is better than wheels. Check the light, visual inspection later. 130, safe airspeed for power reduction. Manifold pressure first, pilot's job, but today your instructor does it. Then RPM. You'll find it all in the tech orders and your checklist. Co-pilot trails cowl flaps, returning each valve to the locked position.
Check your landing gear.
Up left.
Up right.
And when your flight engineer gets an OK on the tail wheel, the switch is returned to neutral. Things happen fast on the takeoff, and it's easy enough to tense up a little. You did well enough, but...
Don't fight her, she won't throw you. On our next takeoff, you'll reduce power. I'll just make the final adjustments. Hold your airspeed to 135 on the climb. What's our power setting?
35 inches, 2,300.
Let's switch back to interphone again.
Do you always use this power setting for climbing?
Yes, with 91 grade fuel and up to 30,000 feet. If you're climbing on instruments, you should hold your airspeed at 160. Are you keeping her trimmed? Turbo and throttle settings always depend on altitude. For instance, if we'd taken off from a sea level field, we wouldn't need turbo or even full throttle for the early part of the climb. Another thing, always cut down manifold pressure before RPM. What's your altitude?
We're nearly 1,000 feet above the field. Fuel boost pumps off?
At 1,000 minimum. Check fuel pressure before and after. Gives you another check on engine fuel pump operation. Look at your manifold pressure. Manifold pressure will creep up steadily on the climb if you don't watch it. As free air pressure decreases on the climb, the pressure differential across the turbo buckets increases. Gives you higher turbo speed and more pressure from the blower.
What about carburetor air filters?
Turn them off at 8,000. Don't often hit dust above that. In emergencies, though, you can use them up to 15,000.
Dust that high?
No, not dust. Carburetor icing conditions.
So now they're ice filters.
In a way, yes.
Filters off.
Filters take air from inside the wing. In the kind of weather that ices up carburetors, air inside the wing is drier and warmer than that you'd get from the ram air intake. Filter light's green, filters off. Check your manifold pressure. Turning the filters off increases the manifold pressure about 1.5 inches. With carburetor icing conditions, of course, you'd use intercoolers hot. But you won't normally get carburetor icing above 12,000. And up there, you'll always want intercoolers cold. Thin air means higher rate of compression from the supercharger, and compression makes heat.
In the wrong places.
Nearly always in the wrong places.
You level off at 10,000 feet and cut her down to the proper setting for maximum long-range performance on 91 grade fuel. Manifold pressure down first to 28 inches. RPM next. You make this adjustment with one eye on the airspeed indicator because you use whatever RPM needed to get 150 miles per hour indicated. In this case, with your conditions, 1,600 RPM. Then fuel mixtures to auto lean. And your co-pilot closes cowl flaps since you have a safe margin in head temperatures.
What about the other power settings?
Well, you've used 3, modified for 91 grade fuel. Takeoff power, 5 minutes maximum continuous operation, climbing power, and maximum long range. They're all there on the panel. The power setting used in normal cruising is always figured from your flight conditions. Desired range, fuel available, weather conditions, altitude, gross weight, and perhaps 1 or 2 other things. In special cases, you'll always figure your best power setting from your flight computer. All settings are arrived at scientifically. Don't improvise. Play them the way they're written. And always keep an eye on your mixtures. In auto lean, don't use more than 29 inches with 91 grade and 2,000 RPM.
Explain something?
Try to.
That 3-point takeoff.
What about it? Didn't it feel right?
Well, maybe I didn't pull it right. I thought it was a little mushy. Isn't it better with the tail up?
Well...
And what about the stall hazard?
Maybe we'd better figure it out on paper.
Well, here we are. An old friend you'll remember from flying school days. She knows her way around. Call her Tail Up Myrtle. Now, take it easy, Myrtle. When Myrtle's parked on the ground, she's sure enough in a stalling or near stalling attitude. So on the takeoff, you lift the tail both to decrease drag and get a safe margin below the stall angle. And she takes off like a nice baby, and there's no arguing about it. But with the missus here, it's different. In the 3-point position, she's already in a flying attitude. On the takeoff run, the relative wind's parallel to the ground. So say the ground makes one leg of your angle of attack. Chord line makes the other leg. Angle of attack in 3-point attitude, about 10 degrees. But with power on, the stalling angle for this airplane's about 19 degrees. So when you hold the tail down on the takeoff, you have a nice cozy margin of 9 degrees below the stall angle. And when you leave the ground, the path of the relative wind changes, so that the angle of attack actually decreases. You get maybe another 4 degrees of safety, and you haven't a care in the world. Now let's dig a little deeper. Think of the forces at work when you take off as a team of little guys who are in there working for or against you all the time. For instance, gross weight of the airplane. On the ground, he bears down hard on the landing gear. When we're ready to start the takeoff run, you'll meet a pal of his, wheel drag. The harder gross weight bears down on the wheels, the bigger and stronger wheel drag gets. That's definitely not good, especially if your runway's soft or slushy. Think of lift as a kind of muscle man working from the wings, pulling up gross weight. Speed makes him pull harder. An increase in the angle of attack also makes him pull harder. Get the relationship between lift, weight on wheels, and wheel drag. The more lift, the less weight on wheels. Less weight on wheels, smaller wheel drag. Then, of course, there's thrust. He's your power. And aerodynamic drag. He's with you all the time, except when you're parked on the ground. Now, let's try to visualize what happens on a 2-point takeoff. At the start of the run, lift increases steadily.
Lift takes more and more weight off the wheels. Taking weight off the wheels steadily reduces wheel drag. Then, just when things are looking good, you lift the tail. Angle of attack decreases. That cuts down lift. Lift lets weight go back down on the wheels, and wheel drag increases again. Aerodynamic drag is cut a little, but not enough to compensate for the extra wheel drag. Speed still won't build up as fast as it would with the tail down. Even on a smooth runway, you'll need more room and maybe 20 or 30 miles an hour more speed to get off than if you'd kept your tail down. If the runway's messed up with mud or slush or water, maybe you won't get off at all in the space you have. But keep the tail down. Take advantage of the three-point angle of attack, and lift goes to work on gross weight right away. Wheel drag gets smaller and smaller. You'll be airborne at maybe 100 miles an hour, and without using up all your runway. And that's something to remember when you're lined up on a nice homemade strip in the jungle, with mud underneath you and trees dead ahead.
Well, how do you like her? It's a very little problem when you get over the field. Say you're coming in after a long mission, you're a little short on gas, and when you arrive, the field's closed in.
Beeline for an alternate base.
No, Sal, you're the hell and gone from nowhere. You're lucky to have one base to come home to.
I'll cut the inboards and hang around until she opens up.
Well, you're to hover all right, but don't cut the inboards. She'll burn more coal on 2 than she will on 4 on long-range settings. Think it over. All right, here we are. Granite stuff straightest below, up to, say, 2,000. Don't know when we'll be able to find a hole in it. Instrument letdowns out. What are you going to do? Don't you like it up here?
Like it better down a bit if I'm low on fuel. Need less power and less fuel for a given indicated airspeed. Air's not so thin. Props take fewer horses.
Okay, that's part of it.
When you get down to 8,000, you give the command for carburetor filters on, and you finally level off at around 500 feet above your...
Need less power and less fuel for a given indicated airspeed. Air's not so thin. Props take fewer horses.
Okay, that's part of it.
When you get down to 8,000, you give the command for carburetor filters on, and you finally level off at around 500 feet above your theoretical overcast.
When you level off above the overcast, the idea is to keep from going places. Now, that's simple. Cut your speed down to 120, even if you have to reduce your RPM to 1250 to get it. Try it first with 1,400 RPM. All right, reduce manifold pressure. Try with 26 inches.
Jettison the Bombardier?
Now, your weight's all right. You've used up most of your gas on the way home, and I hope you didn't bring any bombs back. Cut your RPM down a little more. 1250 is the minimum. With this hovering maneuver, fuel consumption's cut down to about 95 gallons an hour. At the end of a mission, you'll have a light load, so it's absolutely safe. Keep your banks at a 10-degree angle, and just sit it out.
Regular helicopter.
Time to go in, then. Landing instructions from the tower, weather, altimeter setting, and back to work again.
When you're ready for a landing, be sure your co-pilot runs through the checklist. No matter how good you are, flying means fatigue, and fatigue does things to your memory. So if you want to bring in this property without an insurance claim, Have everything checked in order. Altimeter, okay. Crew positions. Automatic pilot, off.
Crew members at their proper stations. Side guns stowed. All turret guns up and pointing rear.
Booster pumps on. Your power plant should be ready for full takeoff power in case a go-round is necessary. Mixtures auto-rich, intercoolers cold, carburetor filters on, wing de-icers off. That's important. Wing de-iceration changes the stalling characteristics of the airplane. Golden Tower, this is 641 on downwind leg, over.
641 on downwind leg, cleared to land, wheels down, over.
Roger.
Landing gear down. Down left.
Down right. Tail wheel down, trailing antenna in. Check brake and hydraulic pressure.
Brakes okay. Pressure around 750.
RPM 2100. Turbos set. Now we have power immediately available for a go-round if we need it. Flaps should be lowered on the downwind leg, but not until airspeed's below 147. 1/3 flaps on the downwing leg, full flaps on final approach. And if you have to go around, you don't need to milk up your flaps. They'll come up slowly enough.
You hold airspeed at 130 indicated on the base leg of the pattern. Then, in a matter of seconds, you make your bank into the final approach.
Full flaps. High RPM.
120. 115. Don't close your throttles until you're sure of a landing. 112. 110. Freezer on. Hydraulic pressure's okay. Otherwise, you'd gunner and take off again. Cowl flaps open and locked. Turbos off. Booster pumps off. Wing flaps up. Get them up sooner if you have a muddy runway. Tail wheel unlocked. Generators.
Generators off.
Cutting the inboard engines is the co-pilot's duty normally. The pilot should keep his mind on his taxiing. But it's quiet on the hangar apron today, and the instructor asked you to do it. Good thing, too, since you weren't too sharp about it.
You can cut your inboards now. Check turbos off first. You need engine oil pressure to open the wastegates. No. Rev them up to 1,000 before you cut them.
working brakes?
No, hold it until the chocks are in. If you set your brakes on hot drums, you'll bake the expander tubes. Don't turn off the ignition until the engines have stopped turning over. Walden Tower, this is 641. Mission complete. See that all other switches are off before turning off the batteries and the main line.
Booster pumps off. Landing gear, wing flaps, neutral. De-icer, anti-icer off. Inverters?
Inverters off only when the instruments have returned to neutral.
Inverters off. Batteries off. Main line off.
Lock control surfaces. That's that. Except for the bookwork. Just give them the facts. One more thing. Record the time of day and number of minutes of oil dilution if you were diluting in this. Well, how do you feel?
Okay, I feel great.
Remember, it's just another airplane. It's a little bigger than most. But the fact that you're flying her means that you've moved into the big time. And the payoff is it's the safest crate you ever flew.
That's part of it. Not all of it by a long shot, but part of it at least. It's a little more complicated than a buckboard wagon. Still, on the other hand, it's not quite as elaborate as a battleship. Make things as easy for yourself as you can by taking advantage of little devices like the flight computer and the load adjuster and the checklist. All the rest, and that's plenty, is up to you. But I guess by this time you understand that pretty well.
Going through B-17 transition training, I was the guy they got to calling Induction Joe. You know how stuff like that gets started. Little things to begin with that had nothing to do with the induction system. Like the time we were going through the control check and I got a little fouled up with the earphones. Well, guys like a laugh now and then, and you're always willing to cooperate. Take little things like that in your stride, and pretty soon they're forgotten. Then comes the day when something serious happens and you begin to worry. Hard Luck Charlie, Induction Joe. Maybe there's something to it. Induction Joe, that was because 9 times out of 10 it was something in the induction system that got me into trouble. Runaway turbo on takeoff, for instance, although that day I did all right. But take that time we were out in a bit of weather. On that occasion, I was just plain ignorant. Our trouble was a little touch of carburetor icing. I started out well enough. Intercooler's hot. Something else now. You see, what was that? Oh, yeah. Air filter's on. But I was still short a trick or two, and I knew it. My co-pilot was an old-timer, good instructor, and I picked up a lot from him. Things like this I never forgot. But all this Induction Joe stuff was beginning to get on my nerves. I think it was the day after that flight that I decided I'd better do something about it. got hold of a copy of the tech order and started boning up on some of that theory stuff. Induction Joe, huh? Okay. I'll make myself a bona fide, Simon Pure, platinum-plated expert on the induction system. Of course, I'd never been much of a guy for book work, but with this, I stuck it out until I could actually see the whole business work. Carburetor filters, turbo, intercooler, combustion chamber, all of it. Although I know a lot of ships nowadays have the electronic turbo control, I sort of stayed with the hydraulic regulator system. That's what we had on my airplane then, and it's on the one I'm flying now. If you have it whipped, the electronic system's pie. It may sound a little corny, but I got to thinking of the whole thing as a B-17's breathing apparatus. So when talking about it, I guess it's a good idea to begin with the nose. So start up here at the leading edge of the wing where the ram air intake's located. That's the nose, at least when you're not using the carburetor air filter. The filter itself, a kind of secondary or substitute nose, is tucked up inside the wing. Position of this valve determines which nose your engine's breathing through. Right now, the toggle switch up in the cockpit is set in the filter's off position, and the valve here blocks off the filter passage. When you flip the toggle for filters on, the door to the ram air intake's shut, and the passage from the filter is open. Normally, use filters always on the ground and up to 8,000 feet. Keep them on above that if dust conditions warrant it, although they shouldn't be used above 15,000. Turbo boost is supplied by the impeller fan. This compressor sucks in air from the outside and forces it ahead to the engine, which at high power settings needs plenty of oxygen. The impeller's powered by an exhaust turbine, which we'll take a look at later. Its speed, of course, is variable. High impeller speed means more compressing power. The more boost you give her in the cockpit, the more speed and compression you'll get down here. But when you compress air, you raise its temperature. The compressed air left of the impeller is hotter than the uncompressed air above it. This heat must be reduced before the air reaches the engine, and that's what the intercooler's for. Little refrigerator job, this intercooler. Cool air from the outside passes over the pipes, cools the hot air going through the pipes. Cold air intake is up here in the leading edge of the wing. The valve's set now for intercooler cold, way you want it except in emergencies. Intercooler hot, valve blocks the intake. But in normal operations, always use intercoolers cold. For except in special emergencies, intake air temperature must be reduced to a safe value for the combustion chamber. Carburetor's the next stop on this cook's tour. And here it is, greatly simplified. Venturi throat at the top. Throttle valve below it. And beneath it, the fuel jet. Watch that jet as we move mixtures from auto-rich to auto-lean. Less fuel, same amount of air. Back to auto-rich. More fuel, air still constant. Now, without changing mixture controls, let's throttle a little and watch that fuel jet. The amount of fuel decreases as the amount of air is cut down by the throttle. Whenever you use the throttles, the carburetor automatically keeps the mixture ratio constant. Watch it when we open the throttle. More air, more fuel, whatever the mixture setting. Engine power, of course, depends upon the amount of fuel burned. But the amount of fuel that can be burned efficiently depends upon the amount of air admitted by the throttle. Hence, more air, figured in pounds, means more power, more thrust, more speed in level flight, or faster rate of climb. Now the engine blower. This impeller is powered by the engine itself. Shares with the turbo supercharger the work of delivering air to the combustion chamber. Speed, or compressing power, varies directly with engine RPM. The manifold delivers air to the cylinder. The barometric reading that registers on your manifold pressure gauge is taken here, between the engine blower and the combustion chamber. At sea level, you can draw 38 inches manifold pressure with the engine blower alone. No turbo boost needed. Turbo supplies the other 8 inches needed for takeoff power. Full throttle, full turbo, 2,500 RPM. Now, let's move on to the combustion chamber, the source of power itself. Intake valve, top right. Exhaust valve, top left. Intake. Compression. Ignition. Exhaust. Intake. Compression. Ignition. Exhaust. Remember, power varies directly with the number of pounds of fuel-air mixture forced into the combustion chamber. That explains the importance of engine blower and turbo. The exhaust gases aren't wasted. They're used, as you know, to power the turbo supercharger here near the end of the stack. We've met the impeller or fan before. Stopped there early in the trip. The bottom wheel here is the turbine, similar in principle to a water turbine with exhaust gas substituted for water. The turbo controls in the cockpit work through the turbo regulator to change the position of the wastegate at the end of the exhaust stack. In its present position, the wastegate is full open, meaning very low turbine speed, no turbo boost. When the wastegate is closed, it forms an obstruction at the end of the exhaust stack, and the exhaust, thus bottled up, must take the only other way out through the turbine nozzles across the turbine buckets, greatly increasing the speed of the turbo. When the wastegate is closed, or partly closed, the exhaust back pressure is greater than the outside air pressure below the turbine nozzles. It's this difference in pressure, or pressure differential, which actually powers the turbine and causes changes in its speed. Closed wastegate, high differential, high speed. Open wastegate, low differential, low turbo speed. The wastegate position perhaps has the greatest effect on turbo speed, but there's another influence also operating, engine RPM. Engine RPM, which you set with your prop pitch controls, determines the speed of the pistons. And, of course, when you increase piston speed, the rate of flow of exhaust gases increases. Obviously, this must affect the speed of the turbo, which is driven by exhaust gases. Let's look at it. Say that now you're turning a low engine RPM. Now, without changing the position of the wastegate, you increase engine RPM. Rate of exhaust flow is increased, and higher turbo speed results. That's worth remembering for a reason we'll see later. Now for the turbo regulator. Turbo adjustments in the cockpit are communicated mechanically to the regulator, which responds by changing the position of the wastegate. This hydraulic regulator does its work by means of engine oil pressure, carried to the regulator by a pressure line and a return line. Loss of oil pressure, naturally, means loss of control over the wastegate. The exhaust balance line provides the regulator with a means of automatic control over the wastegate. This line carries exhaust back pressure to the regulator. Any change in exhaust back pressure here in the stack is communicated directly to the regulator, and the regulator readjusts the position of the wastegate to restore exhaust back pressure to its original value. Remember that your turbo setting in the cockpit is simply a command to the regulator to maintain a constant gas back pressure in the exhaust stack. Manifold pressure may fluctuate at any one setting, but exhaust back pressure will stay constant. Well, that's the way I got to seeing these things after I'd boned away at them a while. If I'd been up on this business right from the start, I'd never have pulled the boner I did once during the mag check. I was doing all right up until then, too. Manifold pressure to 28 inches and both. Left. Yeah, something wrong, all right. Turbo's on during the mag check. That's a bad deal, and I was old enough to know it. But I went on with the mag check, hoping I hadn't wrecked anything. And of course, it was all right when I ran it up to full throttle. But I was way short on turbo boost. The flight was off that day. It was back to the hangar for us, a good burning out for my instructor. Here's what he pounded into my head. Turbos on during the mag check means wastegates closed during the mag check. And, brother, if there's any possibility of an exhaust backfire, the closed wastegate situation is just about as sensible as this one. fellow just about that smart. For closing up the stack with the wastegate during the mag check is every bit as dumb. If you get a backfire, your exhaust stack will make like a cannon. And you're all set for a beautiful backfire during the mag check if only one of your 18 spark plugs in one engine is fouled, as the right one is here. The left plug is carrying the whole burden of ignition in this cylinder. Fouling of plugs, of course, is most likely to occur in the lower cylinders. Now, with the right plug fouled, you're obviously getting combustion in that cylinder on both. And when you switch to left, the situation's unchanged. Remember now, the other 8 cylinders are okay. They're sending hot exhaust charges out into the exhaust stack, heating the stack, making it one long spark plug. So what happens when you switch to right, which means sending an unburned charge out into that stack? The unburned charge is ignited by the heat of the stack and the hot exhaust from the other cylinder. If the wastegate had been open, the backfire could have passed harmlessly out at the end of the stack. Even if all your plugs are clean, you still have a backfire hazard during the mag check. The danger then lies in accidentally switching to off. If that happens, all 9 cylinders will fail to ignite. 9 unburned charges will pass into that hot exhaust stack. I used to have nightmares like that after I got so I really understood this stuff. Now, let's go back to that runaway turbo on takeoff. It can happen before you leave the runway, but we'd just got the gear up when number 4 went crazy. My job was to keep her flying level. Co-pilot cut down that excessive manifold pressure with the throttle, not the turbo. Down to 40 inches and fast, or you'll lose the engine. And here's why you use the throttle. What you're having is wastegate trouble. She's slammed shut. Failure to exercise properly, or mechanical failure, or frozen condensation in the exhaust balance line. Whatever the cause, you get an excessive exhaust back pressure and an extreme pressure differential across the turbine buckets. And your turbo impeller's really running away. And that means excessive pressure is being delivered to the carburetor and manifold. This excessive pressure results in an excessively lean mixture which can damage the engine if allowed to continue long. So work fast. Dam off that pressure with the throttle. Throttle because your turbo control's probably gone anyway. That's all you can do. Save the engine. Keep her flying level and take her back in. I felt all right about the deal that day. Did my part of the job okay. We turned her over to the boys on the line for diagnosis and treatment. Cause of the trouble was failure of mechanical linkage. Ready to fly again in a couple of hours. You know, in some ways, maybe I have a kind of horse and buggy complex. I know all the advantages of the electronic control system, but I still sort of like working out the problems that go along with the hydraulic regulators. Take this pressure differential business, for instance. Anybody can learn to fiddle with the turbo controls during a climb to keep your manifold pressure from creeping up on you. But it's a good thing to know why it must be done. In the cockpit, it's power you're interested in, and power depends on manifold pressure. So after your takeoff, you reduce to 2,300 RPM and 38 inches manifold pressure. And the electronic system would hold her at about that pressure at all altitudes. But with the hydraulic controls, when you reduce to rated power for the climb, it means only that you've ordered your regulator to set the wastegate to maintain a constant gas back pressure in the exhaust. The wastegate to back up a pressure of about 31 inches here in the stack. Stands at around 29 inches. The difference between these two pressures, pressure differential, what's the situation at 5,000 feet if you haven't changed your turbo setting since you reduced power? The regulators kept readjusting the wastegate position to maintain the same exhaust back pressure you had at around 1,031 inches. But atmospheric pressures dropped to around 25 inches. Pressure differential of 31 to 25 instead of 31 to 29. and impeller moving 2 or 3 times as fast as it was at 1,000 feet. It had to speed up some in this thinner air, but not that much. The result shows in the cockpit on your manifold pressure gauge. Pressure here in the manifold far above the value you want for climbing power. And that's the way you lose engines. But the remedy's simple. You order the regulator to open the wastegate a little. The exhaust back pressure decreases. The pressure differential is lowered and the impeller slows down, although, of course, it's still turning faster than it was at 1,000 feet. Your readjustment in the cockpit, of course, is made in terms of the result, manifold pressure, since you have no turbo tack, no instrument for pressure differentials. But the immediate result of turbo readjustment is always a change in the pressure differential across the turbine buckets. And on airplanes equipped with the oil regulators, turbos must be readjusted constantly on the climb. But it was that little tussle with carburetor icing that got me started on this stuff. We were on instruments, plenty of altitude, maximum long-range power setting. Weather, local showers. My instructor wanted me to figure things out for myself. When our manifold pressure began to fall off, I advanced throttles a little. Not too sharp. So my friend gave me a hint. Carburetor air temperature well within icing range. I finally caught on, called for intercoolers hot and carburetor filters on. But that wasn't the whole answer. My co-pilot let me sweat a little before doing what had to be done. Full turbo boost, at the same time, back on the throttles to keep manifold pressure down where we wanted it. That guy was the silent type, but he let me know how he felt. Then he froze on the carb air thermometer for the next 2 or 3 minutes. Well, here's the straight of it. The stuff in that elbow below the fuel jet is ice. Already it's acting as a kind of secondary throttle. That's why your first warning may be a drop in manifold pressure. So defrosting's in order, but quick, before she's throttled off completely. We need heat, and drier air would help. So carburetor filters on. That's the first step. Reason? The filter's inside the wing where the air's heated up a little by the engines. Air in the wing's a little drier than outside air, too. But maybe that isn't enough. So, what about intercoolers hot? Okay. So you shut off that cold air from the outside. Just where will it get you? Suppose you're flying at an altitude where you don't need any turbo boost to maintain the manifold pressure you want. Engine blowers carrying the load alone. The turbo impeller's loafing, little or no compression taking place here. And as a result, intake air temperature is not raised noticeably. So the intercooler's hot trick isn't accomplishing a great deal. For remember, the intercooler cools only. It isn't a heater. In the hot position, it simply stops cooling. The carburetor's still in the jam, and so are you. The idea is to turn on the heat. And you have a nice fire laid right here, ready to touch off. Give her some turbo. Increase turbo RPM, turn on the heat. That gives you a higher rate of compression and raises intake air temperature. That hot intake air is being sent on to the carburetor without intercooling. However, in raising air pressure, we've also increased power, and that we don't want. So, we'll cut down that extra surge of power, manifold pressure, with the throttle. Get it down to the correct cruising value. But that, of course, cuts down pressure only. We're still getting heat in here to the ice. Result? Spring thaw. And, of course, we've been a little slow about it. When you have icing conditions, use these tricks as precautions against icing. Don't wait until you're actually in trouble. And here's another trick. Under certain flight conditions, the wastegates may be nearly closed even though your turbo controls aren't all the way forward. So when you give her full boost, the increase in turbo RPM may not be great enough to give you the compression heat you need. But usually with this turbo condition, you'll be turning a fairly low engine RPM. In this case, we'll fall back on something we learned earlier. The fact that an increase in engine RPM also increases the rate of exhaust, which has the effect of speeding up your turbo. In other words, if you can't get the turbo compression heat you need with the turbo levers, you can fall back on prop pitch and get out of your jam that way. It's a good idea to consult your tech orders for the amount of turbo boost it's safe to use for this job at various altitudes. At high altitude, you have some other induction system problems to worry about. I don't think I ever put on an oxygen mask without thinking of carburetor filters. I suppose because the filter's a kind of a mask. But it's the kind that's hard to breathe through. A dust mask tied, in a way of speaking, over the airplane's nose. Silly, isn't it? But it's pretty obvious that intake air has a harder time getting through this filter than it does through the ram air intake. That's why, when you turn filters on, manifold pressure falls off about 1.5 inches. Filter has a throttling effect, and your reaction is to give her a little more turbo. That, of course, increases turbo speed. And the turbo has a top critical RPM beyond which it isn't guaranteed structurally. If you're climbing to high altitude, carburetor filters put an extra load on the turbo that will force it to exceed its critical speed long before it should, probably at around 20,000 feet. There's another neat way of doing that, too. Open up a hole in the high-pressure side of the system. Flak's good for that, or a pre-ignition backfire will do the trick. Too rapid throttle action before the engine's warm can cause such a backfire. Whatever the cause, you will probably keep increasing turbo boost as you climb to altitude to maintain the 38 inch. Good for that, or a pre-ignition backfire will do the trick. Too rapid throttle action before the engine's warm can cause such a backfire. Whatever the cause, you will probably keep increasing turbo boost as you climb to altitude to maintain the 38 inches you need for rated power. But now you're trying to supercharge the whole substratosphere. And again, the turbo will exceed its critical RPM long before reaching 30,000 feet. Just when will depend on the size of the hole that's opened in her. But suppose your induction system's tight. You get your filters turned off at the right time and reach 30,000 as you should without trouble. If you had an instrument for practically everything, you'd find an induction system situation something like this. Manifold pressure, 38 inches. Wastegate set to back up an exhaust pressure of around 25 inches. Outside barometric pressure, approximately 9 inches. Pressure differential, 25 to 9. Turbo supercharger has reached its top safe speed. Outside air at 9 inches pressure is sucked in by the turbo impeller and compressed to 26 inches. Outside in the weather, it's 48 below. Brass monkey situation. But turbo compression makes it cozy in here. Too cozy for comfort. Downright tropical. Intercooler puts it back in the temperate zone. Passing through the carburetor venturi cools it off some more. Not enough humidity at this altitude for icing trouble. Lost a little pressure on the way. It was 26 inches back there between the turbo and the intercooler. Engine blower finishes the job, building manifold pressure up to the value needed for rated power. If you're climbing above 30,000 feet, keep an eye on the altimeter. When you reach 31,000, reduce manifold pressure 1.5 inches below the rated power value. 36.5 inches at 31,000 and another 1.5 inches for every additional 1,000 feet. The reason is that rated power can't be maintained up here without forcing the turbo to exceed its maximum safe RPM because of the low outside air pressure. Some turbos have a higher critical altitude, but the principle's the same for all 17s equipped with oil regulators. Get the principle and you'll never go far wrong in practice. Well, I guess that's the text of my sermon. My own luck changed for the better as soon as I could see what's likely to happen with a closed wastegate during the mag check. Knowing you can dam off the excessive pressure from a runaway turbo with the throttle will get you out of a lot of takeoff jams. With hydraulic regulators, decreasing barometric pressure on the climb will give you higher turbo speeds unless you readjust the position of the wastegate. When you run into carburetor icing conditions, remember the filter's inside the wing where the air's comparatively dry and warm. And that intercooler's hot won't do you any good unless your turbo's busy generating heat. Your carburetor filter's fine for dust and handy when you have carburetor icing, but it's a hard thing for an engine to breathe through and should not be used at high altitude. Damage done by pre-ignition backfire can result in turbo overspeeding at altitude. Fast throttle action before the engines are warm can do you the dirt. And reduce manifold pressure as you climb above your turbo's critical altitude. Airplanes, of course, aren't frozen. Improvements are being made constantly. Check your knowledge as often as possible against new directives and tech orders. In the end, it should all add up to a nice fat margin of safety. And to fatten that up, brother, even I'm willing to do a little bookwork.